Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world for the better. Nelson Mandela. A very good morning to everyone present here today on this virtual platform of learning. I, Javeria Noshin, Assistant Professor, Department of English, School of Commerce, Jain deemed to be University, extend a hearty welcome to the chief guest for the day, our director, heads of various departments, coordinators, faculty members, and all the participants from various institutions and the corporate sector to a national level webinar on National Educational Policy 2020, a review. Jain deemed to be University has always strived to be an intellectual institution that houses students from more than 38 countries in this hub of knowledge to learn and better themselves. Our university takes pride in providing not only quality education to students, but also catering to their overall development. The theme for today's webinar aims at discussing the impact of National Educational Policy 2020 in the field of education. This webinar is planned and executed by Shamshodhana, the Faculty Research Cell, School of Commerce, Jain deemed to be University. Shamshodhana is instrumental in encouraging and providing a platform for research to all the aspiring scholars in the field of academics. It is also instrumental in organizing conferences, seminars, workshops since its inception. During this pandemic, the research cell has hosted 7 webinars so far, and today being the 8th, on various themes and topics to keep the intellectual discussion going. I now would feel very honored to introduce the speaker for the day, Dr. Viraj Kumar. Dr. Viraj Kumar is a visiting professor at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and he chairs ACM, India's Special Interest Group for CS Education. Sir has a doctoral degree in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His primary research area includes educational technology with an emphasis on India, focusing on specific challenges and solutions. He has contributed to 2 task groups related to educational technology constituted by the Karnataka Knowledge Commission and served as a chief consultant to the drafting committee of National Educational Policy, MHRD, Government of India. On behalf of Shamshodhana Research Cell, School of Commerce, Jain deemed to be University, I extend a warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now request sir to address the most awaited audience.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope my voice is audible. I'm going to stop the video and start the screen share now. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the organizers and look forward to leaving enough time for questions at the end. So I thought I would, I think my screen share has stopped. Shall I try? There's some other participant who has shared the screen. Okay, let me try again. Okay. So the screen share keeps stopping. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. Let me try again. The host has disabled screen sharing, it says.
Sharmila ma'am?
Sir, you can share it, sir.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Somehow I'm...
1 minute, sir.
Yeah.
So try now.
It still says disabled. Okay, now it's enabled. Okay, so I hope this will stay. Okay, so the policy document is, I'm hoping lots of people have accessed it from the MHRD website. It's a 66-page document. And just for context, the draft that the committee had submitted was about 480 pages, right? And of course, it's important to remember that in the draft, there was a vast amount of that 480 pages was providing the context for the policy points. I mean, the policy points themselves have been condensed and reorganized in the final policy. But the fact remains that the bulk of the draft document that was submitted was context. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping to share in this talk is some of the context around this. So there's someone who is drawing on top of my screen, and so I think some of the controls for the participants have to be disabled, otherwise we will have this issue. So someone is drawing arrows on top of the screen, which is not under my control. Can I just request the organizers to disable these kinds of interruptions?
Yes, sir. We'll do that.
So you can let me know when I can proceed. I will pause until we have.
Sir, you please proceed, sir. We'll take care of it. Thank
you. Okay, and may I just request whoever is doing this, in the interests of good common sense, please refrain from drawing on the screen. It is disturbing to everybody else. Maybe good common sense is in short supply for the person who is doing this. Okay, so there are many things to look at in the policy, and I will basically just focus on three themes.
Madam, can you make out who is this, and can you just
yeah, ma'am, yeah,
remove them from the audience?
Sure, ma'am.
Please, and disable the annotations of the participants, ma'am.
No, ma'am, actually that option is not there. I'm just checking it, ma'am. Just give me some time.
Yeah. We are sorry about that, sir. I hope audience will kindly be graceful and behave. We were very much waiting and looking forward to this session. So kindly be graceful enough and participate positively. Thank you.
Yes, of course, it is only just one person probably being very silly. I'm delighted that there's over 350 participants here. Okay, so thank you for I think that should hopefully deal with the issue. So there are many things to look at in the policy, and in the time available, it is impossible to look at everything. In fact, I noticed even in the chat there were some questions that already started asking points that I don't plan to cover in depth here. So I will be happy to answer points beyond these three themes that I want to focus on. I've chosen these three themes because in all our past experience with education policies, the policy documents themselves are very well thought out, and the challenge has always been in the implementation. So I think for all of us to remain realistic about the situation, we are all, of course, hoping and counting on the fact that the policy will be implemented with a strong leadership and vision in the spirit in which the policy is written. And there are many points in the policy that rely on this, that the policy statements are in fact implemented. Right? We also know from a realistic perspective, there are points in previous policies that have still not been implemented despite many years since the policies were created. So the reason I have chosen to focus on these three themes is that I think if we as a community of educators who are on this call understand the spirit behind these points, I don't think we need anybody's permission to go ahead and start our work, our part in this national effort to improve the quality of our education. So it is in this spirit that I have chosen these 3 points that I would like to focus on. So let me start with the first point about the students entering the higher education system. So I will mainly focus on higher education, but I want to give you a flavor of the journey of students coming into our higher education system. What is the plan for the policy in terms of how this new generation of students will enter our system, right? So again, this is going to be beyond our control in some sense, but I want us to understand that this is where the policy is trying to move. And if things work out well, we will be in a position to receive in the higher education system students who have gone through a very different process from what we ourselves went through in our schooling, right? So I think the piece that has got the most visibility in the press when the policy came out was, the revised schooling structure. Instead of the 10+2, there was this 5+3+3+4. And there is a great deal of emphasis on schooling in the policy document, which again I'm not going to spend a lot of time on in this talk. I'm happy to address whatever I can in terms of questions later. One thing I want to point out, the policy is very clear that we have a crisis, right? It uses this word learning crisis early in the document. Because I think that is an accurate reflection of one of the biggest challenges of the current system, and particularly the schooling system, because many of our students fail to achieve even basic literacy and numeracy, just basic abilities to read and comprehend a simple text, and basic abilities in adding and subtracting and things like that. Because the foundation is so weak, so many of our fellow Indians fall out. I think one of the successes of the last few years undoubtedly has been our ability to increase enrollment in the first few years, grade 1 and 2, to the point where those numbers are very high. I mean, they're very close to approaching 100%, and we have done a wonderful job in increasing those numbers. The problem has been, of course, those numbers fall down dramatically by the time we get to higher education. They are very low, roughly 26-27%. Of course, the intention is to raise that GER to 50% as quickly as we can. But the fact remains that students are dropping out because they are being left behind. They're not achieving these basic competencies. Of course, if they don't achieve basic foundational literacy, numeracy, it is very hard for students to see motivation in remaining, even if all the other challenges in students' lives were taken care of. Of course, we know even that is not the case, sadly, but this is a major challenge. And the policy, I think, rightly uses this strong term, learning crisis, which I think we all as Indians sense that we do have a learning crisis at all levels of our education system. So I want to say that first and foremost, because much of what the policy is trying to do is trying to address this, right? And just changing the schooling structure, of course, is not going to just be a magic solution to this crisis, but it is an important part. There are many policy points that try and address this learning crisis. So this is the graphic from the policy. I have just taken the graphic from there. On the left is our old 10+2 structure, and the policy has extended this to this longer 5+3+3+4 structure. And to answer the question, why is this new structure there? I mean, the short answer to this is, when this policy was written, we have had the benefit of a lot of advances in developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, educational psychology. And the committee received input from experts, which led to this revised structure that says, look, we have to recognize that the 10+2 structure is not based on on our understanding of student development. So the reason we have this 5-year period, this it's shown on the bottom green block. We know from biology that the brain of young children is growing very rapidly in this early phase, and it's growing at different rates. I mean, different children are maturing in different capacities at different rates. So having a regimented structure, in grade 1, everyone is going to do X, and then grade 2, everyone is going to do Y, doesn't make sense, right? Also, we know from decades of experience that those members of our communities who come from the weakest social sectors, they don't have opportunities prior to joining class 1. Very few educational opportunities prior to that, whereas those who are more well off come from these have opportunities to go to preschool. The preschool whole area was heavily unregulated. So all this has led to this policy that no, there needs to be RTE needs to be extended, that we have to cover the first 3 years. We have to have a system over here where in these first 5 years, it is not regimented, it is unstructured, but it is focused on play, activity, inquiry. And so this setting up this foundation becomes very strong. Then, there is also the statement in the policy, which again has attracted a lot of attention, but it's again based in science that, at this early stage, students have this capacity to learn languages. I mean, it is a kind of a use or lose it capacity. If at that stage they don't acquire multiple languages, it becomes that much harder to acquire new languages later. So it is an opportunity. We are fortunate to be in a country which has so much diversity of language, and it is often the case that students are exposed to multiple languages. There is every evidence that exposure to multiple languages is a net benefit for students. So just this ability in this playful, activity-based, inquiry-based learning to play around with multiple languages, with the rich languages that we are fortunate to be surrounded in, is an excellent way for students to develop this strong base and to develop a sense of understanding of the richness of our country. So there is this statement in the policy that we should try and have multiple languages as early as possible. Not in the sense of learning the grammar and learning the rules, but just exposure and immersion to the language, how it is used. And as the students get older, and this starts having now implications because it starts laying the groundwork for higher education. There are statements that we should try and make sure that as many subjects as possible are in this bilingual mode. And the reason I say this has implications for higher education, I recall one of the powerful statements that was put to the committee in one of the deliberations was a discussion on scientists in other countries. And the examples that were given were, for example, scientists in Italy or scientists in South Korea. And the statement was that, if you speak to any of these scientists, most of the time, and it doesn't have to be scientists, it could be scholars of any kind, or indeed, human beings of any kind, that when they think of their thoughts, in this case, the person was talking about scientists, they were saying when these scientists think about their work, they think in Italian or they think in Korean, because that is the language in which they are most fluent in, and that is the language in which they have learned their craft. Now, when it comes to communicating with the rest of the world, since the rest of the world speaks English or communicates science in English, generally speaking, they also know English, but then they translate their thoughts into English for the purposes of sharing with the wider community. And the point that the person was trying to make was that, since in our present system in higher education, we are almost entirely in English, except for higher education in specific languages, we are actually hobbling our own students, when it comes to higher education. And to address this will take a long time, but one of the ways we can start addressing it is right at the school level, when students are first introduced to history and geography and science and all the various subjects. Can we at that stage teach them those concepts in multiple languages? So not just English, but also the language that they would be most familiar with. And in fact, this would provide them with the vocabulary in a language that they're familiar with. It will down the road provide them the opportunity to think their thoughts in the language that they're most comfortable in. And perhaps this will address some of the issues that we see later on. So these are some of the changes that are there. And then the last thing I wanted to say at the school level was this idea that we should increase exposure to vocational education, right? And I will say a little bit more about vocational education in a moment. But the basic idea is that when you finish this 5+3+3+4, the students will now have opportunities to branch off into higher education and either choose specifically a vocational track or what we have more traditionally considered as higher education, although as we will see in the policy, these two are still considered very much part of higher education. So I want to share a quote because the chairman of the committee, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, recently when the policy was announced, he gave a talk, and so I have a few quotes from that talk that I thought were particularly important to highlight. So I will share one of them in this context, and he's talking about why the policy has proposed this structure, and he says the schooling system that respects these natural developmental phases is essential for preparing students for higher education. So there is a sense in which biology tells us that this is how human beings develop, and it is following that science. It is following this insight from science that this is why the structure is there. So it's not arbitrary. The 10+2 structure really had no basis in science, whereas this new policy is proposing a structure that is hopefully more likely to succeed. As I said, there are many challenges that the new system has to address. The intention of this new structure is to at least align with what we know about students and their development at this early stage. So this is about all I will say at the school level, and I'm sure there are questions beyond this at the school level, but I will focus the rest of the talk mainly on higher education. I thought it was important to set this sort of basic context for where students are coming from. So we ended this slide on talking about vocational education. Let me spend a little bit more time about this. So there is substantial emphasis on vocational education in the document. In fact, if you just search in the PDF file that I linked to, if you search for the word vocational, you'll see that there are 76 occurrences of the word vocational. And I remind you that there are 66 pages in the document. So there is, on average, more than one occurrence of the word vocational on every page of that document, right? So that is, that is a crude way of saying that, yes, the document focuses a lot, right? And the reason it focuses a lot is the recognition that as a nation, we have, seriously undervalued vocational education. And this is not a new observation. Just to cite one example, and which the policy also cites, if you go back and look at the 12th five-year plan, it was pointing out that, as a nation, if you look at our workforce in the age group 19 to 24, less than 5% of our workforce receives some sort of formal vocational education. And, if you look at other countries, there are several other countries one can look at, these numbers are much higher. So, this is not to say that just because other countries are doing something, we are therefore incorrect, but it certainly should give us a pause to think, well, are these other countries doing things that we are missing out on, and are we failing to give vocational education enough credit, right? And so in the new education policy, you will see that vocational education is very much part of higher education. And what I mentioned on the previous slide was introducing vocational education even within schooling to provide students this opportunity to go further into vocational training if that is what they want. And here again, I will just say that it's not only that the policy is saying that vocational education is critical for developing these sort of hands-on skills that are absolutely essential. But there is something more than that. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals talk about this, right? I mean, that the educational systems have to provide the students with relevant skills, and vocational is one of those skills that are there because they recognize that increasingly for employment or entrepreneurship, these skills are going to be very, very important. And here again, I would like to just share this small quote from the speech that Dr. Rangan gave a few days ago. Where he links this, he says, if you look at it, there are likely to be these hybrid jobs. I mean, in some sense, these jobs have already come, and in other countries, they're coming at a faster rate. But it is almost entirely predictable at this stage that there will be a shift towards jobs where the human being is complemented with some high-tech equipment, right? And so let me give you a precise example of this. I mean, here is a video from a Hyderabad-based company on YouTube, which I'm not going to play the video. I'm just going to share a screenshot. If you're interested, you can just search for it. But what I want to show you in this video is this view that you can see is a trainee technician who is looking at some sort of motor. I mean, I think it's an air blower or something like that. I'm not familiar with the particular domain. So this is a trainee who is looking at this air blower, but they're looking at it through a tablet, right? So they have holding up a tablet, some sort of iPad or something like that, and they're through the camera they're viewing this. And what you can see is this orange circle and this gray grill that you can see in the front. This has been recognized by the tablet using vision. It's recognizing this thing that this is the component that the trainee is looking at. So it is superimposing an image of that. The orange circle and the gray grill is actually imposed using this augmented reality technology on top of the field of view that the technician is seeing. And if you look carefully on the top of that, vertically from the top at the 12 o'clock position, there looks like a screwdriver that is coming. Even that is virtually imposed, and there are some instructions for the technician that this is what you should be doing. I'm using this as a simple example to demonstrate Dr. Rangan's point that this particular trainee and this particular technician, when he or she goes to the field, will have access to such tools in the future. And what Dr. Rangan was trying to say is that providing access to these kinds of high-tech jobs in the future should very much be part of higher education. It is training people for this new reality where tools and techniques are going to, technology is going to complement human behavior. In some cases, of course, there is a real threat, and we have to recognize this. There is a real threat that technologies will, in fact, disrupt some of the job opportunities that are there presently. And so it is therefore going to be a requirement for individuals to complement these, increase their own skills in ways that complement the available technology. So this is a very difficult trend to predict, but what is clear, I mean, it's difficult to predict in its details in terms of whether exactly something like this will come up or whether it will be something else. I'm using this as an illustration of the point that Dr. Kasturi Rangan was trying to make. So these are some of the reasons why vocational education in the higher education becomes critical, and the policy talks about having vocational education very much part of higher education. I want to say a few things about, as we're looking at these students coming into higher education, a few things about the entry process. So the policy does make a few points about board examinations. I just want to share those points. The policy very clearly recognizes that we are doing our young generation a huge disservice. In fact, it uses the word harmful effects, because I think that is fair and correct. That we have essentially this parallel education system, this coaching culture, which is helping, is supposed to help students crack some of these exams and therefore get into higher education. But the fact is clear that, firstly, this is imposes a barrier for some students, those who do not have the economic resources to take some of these private coaching classes. That, of course, is the first concern. And the second concern is that these barriers and this ability to crack these exams is really not advancing anybody's educational interests. I mean, the ability to crack some of these exams is based on a skill set which is completely irrelevant in the rest of the world. I mean, the ability to answer, let us say, JEE questions at tremendous speed has absolutely no relevance to a student's long-term abilities as a human being or as a skilled engineer or anything like that, right? It is completely nonsensical, and it is an extremely wasteful situation, and in fact, say exactly the words that the policy does. It is harmful to our students to put them through this. But the fact remains that the board exams do have this gatekeeping role that they have assumed in some sense in higher education. So one of the things the policy is saying is, no, we will have these board exams, but they will be made easier in the sense that they're going to focus on these core capacities, and basically anyone who has understood these core capacities, these core skills, will be able to do well. I mean, this is also a recognition of the fact that our current system doesn't even get us to that, right? I mentioned earlier how so many students drop out well before they even get to, say, class 10th and class 12th board exams, because they are failing to even get these basics right. So it's important to have at the exit of the school this check that, all right, at least these basic skill sets are being attained by students, and really the board exam should do nothing more than that, right? But then, of course, institutions of higher education would like to be selective, and if in some sense, if the board exams are so easy, then how are institutions going to look at these as a filtering mechanism to decide who to offer positions to, because there are going to be limitations on seats. Or the most selective institutions will want to select the best students. So again, I'm seeing someone thinking, yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's look at the second part, which is the entrance examinations. Again, the policy makes some statements here. So the idea of the policy is to have something similar. So the principles will be the same, right? And there has been this proposal to set up this national testing agency, which will have this role, right? And again, these exams that the NTA is going to conduct are not going to test speed and ability to crack, quote unquote, certain types of questions, but will provide a range of questions that will test conceptual understanding and the ability to apply this thing, right? And again, the idea is to set it up in a way where coaching is not the make or break criterion, right? Now, in some sense, this is one of those things that one of the points in the policy where it remains to be seen how effective this organization is going to be. I mean, the policy says that this NTA will provide high quality range and flexibility of exams, right? And the idea of having that is that then individual universities won't have to offer their own entrance tests. They will have the opportunity to use the NTA assessments. The policy is very clear that it is still left up to individual universities and colleges, but we don't want students to be burdened with so many different exams. Again, it doesn't benefit the students for sure. By having all these different entrance exams to prepare for. So if there is an organization such as the NTA that is able to provide the single trustable high quality assessment, then there is an opportunity for everybody to unburden themselves and to benefit from this. At the same time, it still leaves it to individual universities and colleges to have their own entrance criteria, including their own entrance tests, right? But here again, there is an opportunity for consensus amongst institutions that if it is recognized that NTA is producing good quality tests, then there is every incentive for institutions to use that as a filtering mechanism to select the best students. So I think this reflects the philosophy behind many of the policy points, where there is a commitment to create a quality resource or a quality service, and failing that, or if that takes a while, there is always the opportunity, there is always the space provided for individual institutions and individuals themselves to take their own course. Right. So I think this reflects many of the basic philosophy behind many of the points. All right. So with that, I think I'll move to the second part. So this was the discussion about the students coming into the system. So the policy for higher education itself, it makes it very clear that it seeks to have a system of holistic and multidisciplinary education. So why this, right? And I think that's it's important to say a few very clear statements about these words, holistic and multidisciplinary, because there should not be any doubt about what these are and what they imply, right? So I think the first thing to say is that holistic is not to be equated with industry relevant soft skills, right? When we talk about developing not just the intellectual capacity of students, but all capacities, all human capacities, including the aesthetic sense, empathy, communication, and the many other things that we want to develop. Some of them are relevant to industry when it comes to employability, such as communication, but a sense of ethics, a sense of aesthetics. I mean, it's less easy for industries to ascribe economic value to these things, but that doesn't mean they're not important for the development of individuals, of human beings, for coming up, for having a society down the road which is consists of just and fair-minded individuals. So it's very important to have holistic education, and it is in that spirit that the word holistic is used. The second word, multidisciplinary, right? I mean, one of the very important concerns that has been raised as well, if you say multidisciplinary, then that will mean, in the 4-year period, there will be less time to focus on our main discipline. So I happen to be a computer scientist. So as a computer science faculty, I might say, look, in 4 years, look, we have so much to cover. There are so many courses that have to be covered. And now you're telling me that we have to be multidisciplinary, and won't that mean there'll be less time? So there is no beating about the bush here. Yes, the focus towards multidisciplinarity will mean less time for the main discipline, right? And this is a major source of concern. And in fact, I would say this is a concern shared by every stakeholder, that, especially if you're concerned about job readiness, that, if you are saying that there's going to be less emphasis on the core discipline, whatever it is, whether it is biology or whether it is computer science or whether it is any other discipline that the history, whatever the discipline is that the student is studying, if you want that curriculum to be multidisciplinary, will that not mean there is less preparation for the world of work, right? And here again, I think there was a wise statement that Dr. Kasturirangan made in his talk, which is also reflected in the policy. And this is what he said. He said a short-sighted policy would simply have called for improving job readiness on day one. In contrast, this policy recognizes that such an approach which just tries to focus on job readiness, is dangerously out of step with a world that is rapidly changing. So this policy recognizes that students have to be given a much broader base, and it has to be a multidisciplinary base, a multidisciplinary foundation, so that they can adapt and reinvent themselves as necessary. So I think the point here that he was trying to make is that, if you look at all the stakeholders, I mean, let us just examine them briefly for a minute. I mean, if you look at institutions, right? My institution might feel it's much better for us to spend our time drilling the students to be job ready on day one. I mean, jobs. You have to know all the latest skills in order to be ready. We want you to crack the interview. We want to have 100% placement. That is a very important metric for us as a university. We want to be able to tout it to the outside world. See, please come and join our institution. All our students get jobs and they get this pay packet, etc. Right? Now, what is wrong with that, or what is short-sighted? Why is Dr. Kasturirangan using this term short-sighted? I mean, if you recognize that he's talking about how rapidly the world of work is changing, right? So yes, today, the students that you churn out and you drill and you fine tune will be job ready on day one. But tomorrow, the skills that will be required by those same industries who have employed them will be different. And if the students that your institution has churned out are masters of just that one set of skills and are unable to adapt and reinvent themselves for the new world, then they're going to be replaced very quickly by the next set of graduates which these universities are churning out. I mean, there is going to be absolutely no reason to believe that that employers will stick to old employees for out of loyalty or anything like that. I mean, they will be focused on the bottom line. The world is ruthless in that way, for better or worse. It is increasingly that way, and absent any other major social shift on this front, the expectation is that human beings themselves, the graduates themselves, would have to be prepared for being able to reinvent themselves, right? So this is the tension that is clear. And I mentioned at the top of this quote that this is a concern shared by all. By that I mean, not only is it institutions. I mean, institutions are one can see where their short-term interest on this would lie. After the student has graduated, after the student has helped the institution achieve that 100% or 95% placement, or whatever it is, the metric that is of interest, then there doesn't seem to be any good reason for the institution to be long-term invested in that student, that graduate's future trajectory. And the only stakeholder who is certainly invested in that long-term interest is the student themselves. And it is often the case that the student who is entering higher education, is also very deeply concerned about, well, I need to get a job after this. This better prepare me for a job, right? And so there is this tension that needs to be addressed. And what the policy is trying to do in this point is take a stand that it is absolutely critical for the long-term benefit of graduates that they be given a broad base, even if they find it difficult to recognize this fact today, and even if institutions find it difficult to come behind this point, it will be important, right? So I just wanted to stress that. And essentially, higher education has to lay this strong foundation for lifelong learning, for the ability to adapt, because eventually for that individual, for that student, that is going to be critical. And if we over focus on one set of skills, one domain, we may do well in the short term. The person themselves may do well in the short term, but there is a serious risk that we undermine their long-term abilities. And that is something that the policy is trying to foresee and trying to address. So I know this is a contentious point, and I'm not claiming that my only goal here is to convince you that the policy is right, but just to share the perspective with you, so that when we have a debate on this point or other points, at least I have shared this viewpoint with you. This idea of multidisciplinarity also applies to school teacher education. So the policy states that it will move school teacher education to higher education in a substantial way. Again, it is expecting universities and colleges to be multidisciplinary, and one of those disciplines being school teacher education. It is essentially saying that our present system of these standalone TEIs, the teacher education institutions, is not benefiting the teachers. And it is also disrupting the possible multidisciplinarity between education, school education, and all the other disciplines, right? So moving them to the higher education space is the right thing to do on both those fronts. I wanted to just share this because I know JN University itself has education programs. It has online programs. When it comes to teacher training, not only for teachers who are doing their initial training from remote areas, also for in-service teacher training, the policy does talk about how open and distance learning, ODL, is going to be a critically important role to play. I would say particularly in the latter case for in-service teachers, I think much of this training will have to be done in the online mode, because doing the in-person mode is highly disruptive, especially for teachers who are in remote areas. It takes just far too many resources to bring them physically. And I think this point about ODL brings me to quite neatly to the last point, which I wanted to talk about, which is obviously something that we are all grappling with in the current pandemic situation, which is online education. But before that, also the role of technology in education. So this happens to be, the area that is of most interest to me as a researcher. So I will spend, maybe there are a few more slides here, but I will skim through them in the interest of time. I want to make sure that we end at 12 o'clock so that there is ample time for questions. I'm delighted to see that the chat part is very active. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I want to make sure we have time for that. So I'll just say a few things here, and maybe I'll skip a few of the slides that I have in this section. So, one of the things that the policy recognizes that technology cannot address all the challenges, right? I mean, these are non-overlapping regions, right? So obviously, if you come to things like improving teacher service environment, technology doesn't have a direct role to play over there. On the other hand, it's not that every time you apply technology, you are going to improve some of the challenges, you're going to address some of the challenges. I will just say, for example, if you look at smart boards, on balance, they have actually ended up creating more problems. They become these white elephants in our classroom because they don't really end up addressing the key challenges that they they were meant to address. And more seriously than that example, I would say when it comes to disruptive technologies, the policy does go a little bit in depth into. When you look at, say, technologies like AI, yes, there are ways in which AI can address certain challenges, can improve certain situations, but we have to recognize that many of these these technologies are highly disruptive, and they are more likely to create new challenges, and the set of challenges that they create are likely to be much more, right? So that the policy does talk about these disruptive technologies. And I just, as a sort of historical note, when the draft was submitted, which was in May of 2019, of course, we didn't have the COVID situation, right? And that, of course, has imposed yet another disruption. I mean, it has disrupted, of course, the entire educational system. So, there was a some last minute consultations around this, where inputs from the various committee members and even us in the consultancy was requested. So my last input, for example, into the policy was earlier this year, where I did share some inputs on how we can go about addressing these particular challenges thrown up by the COVID pandemic. Right. So I put this on the boundary because it is creating new challenges, and technology will have to play some role in addressing this, because we have moved entirely to online as we are struggling to reopen our educational system. So in this context, the policy does say a few things. I want to first just talk about, even prior to this pandemic, if you look at access to content in general, even the offline content, the policy very clearly articulates that one of the big challenges we have is simply getting students access to this content because of language barriers. For students with disabilities, there are separate issues. So at some point, technology will have to play a role, and natural language processing has been touted as this technology that is going to play a role. And later on, at the end of the slide, my talk, I will get back to this point where I see that maybe there are other ways in which the way we are framing the problem and trying natural language processing to help us may not be the only way. And at least I would like to suggest one other way. But I want to share with you that when we had the discussions with students, student groups and NGOs that cater to students with disabilities, one of the important points was that when it comes to sign language, there is no standard sign language, and this imposes a huge challenge for students with disabilities. I mean, this is just one disability, but there are many challenges like this that technology can and will have to play a role. Again, technologies such as NLP, but also computer vision, would play a role in helping students like this, or could play a role in helping students like this. But when it comes to online content, and again, this is a challenge even before COVID. Online education is not an easy thing to get right. I think all of us have fully recognized this now. And the policy talks about how there are risks, there are dangers, and therefore there is the need to do some pilot studies, very carefully designed pilot studies, that is this the right way we should go about it? What is the right way of doing online education? Especially those of us who are parents with young children, we have always concerned with our children spending a lot of time on the screen. And I think a fair criticism of the current approach is it is too screen intensive and there is no focus on anything else. So the policy does talk about this as being a major risk. Another thing the policy talks about, which I think is perhaps even more important in its implications on fairness, is just simply the issue of equity, right? This digital divide. Some people have access to devices, some people have access to internet, whereas others don't. And clearly, any move towards online education has to recognize this and has to rectify it. So I will maybe skip some of these points. I mean, we've talked, access to devices and things like that. I will only just say here is that at least when it comes to things like content creation, we have probably done a good job, I would say. There are a lot of initiatives on content creation, content delivery. There has been done a lot of work done, even immediately post independence, but that work is certainly not complete by any stretch, but it is certainly work in progress. I think there has been a progress in that space. One space where those of you who are technologists, I think there is space is it's not just that we are looking at content delivery. We are also looking at interactivity. So when students want to ask questions, then the technology has to enable that. I think one of the areas which we are probably doing less well on is exploring the space of intelligence on the device to immediately answer some of the students' doubts, students' misconceptions, without requiring an immediate human in the loop. Right. So I just wanted to share that for those of you who are in the technology space. This might be an interesting thing to look at. To put all these pieces together, the policy talks about this National Educational Technology Forum, because what is clearly missing in the current setup for the government is a common space in which these developments can be examined. And the policy is quite clear. It uses this word forum, that this has to provide a platform for the free exchange of ideas. And then this forum will have these four major functions. And the most important one I would like to highlight here is that this forum will evaluate technologies and then will provide advice to governments that, you know, these are the right technologies to look at. Because currently the situation is quite clear. The advice that the governments are getting, the state and central governments are getting, heavily influenced by the various technology providers themselves. Of course, they often have financial incentives to push their own products. These are not necessarily well tested from their pedagogical benefit, their cost benefits. So this sort of evaluation has to be done, and one of the roles of NetF is to provide this. And there are a few other roles. In the interest of time, I will skip over. I'd be happy to come back to this if there are specific questions on this. Lastly, I would like to say that this National Education Technology Forum is also a space to promote EdTech research. The policy talks about how this NetF will organize multiple regional and national conferences around this space. I would also like to just quickly take this opportunity to share with you, if any of you are interested, please take a look at this conference. This would be, I would imagine, one of the types of conferences that eventually would come under this NetF umbrella. So this is a conference that ACM India is hosting at the end of the year. It's a virtual conference, which will have to be the case given the pandemic situation. And if you are at all interested in computing education, this would be an interesting conference to take a look at. The deadlines for submission are in September, late September, so there is still plenty of time if you're interested in this space to take a look at this. But the basic point here is that NetF will be involved in creating the space for educational technology research. And even if you're in other areas of research, especially if you're in areas of disruptive technologies, like I said, AI, things like that, one of the roles for the National Educational Technology Forum is to assess some of these disruptive technologies and say, is it the case that they're going to cause, to assess potentially disruptive technologies and say, is it that they're likely to cause challenges? Okay, so the last point I'm going to make is, an appeal to all of you. And, you may be, professors with established research programs, or you may be a young PhD scholar, you may be a junior professor, maybe you're mentoring some students, right? Or you may actually be a student. Some of you may be students and you're interested in some interesting projects. So my appeal to all of you, and this is on behalf of the policy, because the policy also makes this quite clear that this is an appeal to all of us as Indians who are deeply concerned about these challenges. Our country needs us. Our country needs our ideas. It needs our hard work. And one group that I have not included in this list, this bulleted list, which should be included, is young entrepreneurs. And the policy explicitly calls out and appeals to these groups and says, given the pace of technological development, allied with the sheer creativity of student entrepreneurs, it is certain that technology will impact education in multiple ways. And as I have pointed out in this talk, there are critical needs where technology has to play a role. And this is an appeal for all of us who have interest in this space to contribute. So I'm going to close with just one example of this. I mentioned earlier this point that was talking about natural language processing, but I also mentioned that I think simplifying it as, through better natural language processing may not be the best way to go. Critically, what is lacking in the ability to use natural language processing for our context is we don't have enough digital data in all our languages. And this is why the policy uses this word. It will be dovetailed with efforts to teach language. So actually, I want to just share some data points here. If you have ever taken a look at a site called Duolingo, right? It's to learn other languages. So for example, if you're a Hindi speaker and you want to learn English, they have a course, and there's already 3.5 million people who are Hindi speakers learning English on Duolingo. But if you try to find the same thing for Kannada, I was unable to find it. I was able to find something for Tamil, and it said, well, we are still creating the course and we have 2 contributors for Tamil. But I remember looking at this maybe a year and a half ago, and at that time there was some work on creating a resource for Kannada, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But even for Tamil, there was some work that was done. That course at least seems to be working. So that is one data point I want to share. The other data point I want to share is if you look at Wikipedia and you look at what are the languages for all the articles on Wikipedia. I mean, this big white space at the bottom, this is almost 40% of all articles. These are in other languages, very small slices of the pie. The biggest slice of the pie, not surprisingly, is English. But I think the most surprising is the second and the third language on that list, right? And if you look at why, you find that turns out there's a Swedish researcher, and his wife happens to speak the second language, which I was actually not even aware of until a few days ago, Cebuano, if that's how you pronounce it. That researcher has developed a bot, a piece of technology that translates articles into this language, right? And, can we do this for Kannada? Well, we don't have a very active group of Kannada speakers. I'm just using Kannada as an example. I mean, there are many other languages, of course, in our country, but there is certainly an opportunity here. I mean, it's not that Wikipedia is the only yardstick one can look at, but if you think about all of us who, if we want to get started with something, Wikipedia might provide a good starting point. And there are many students in our who we know of personally, even, who would benefit from having access to Kannada, right? And so there is no Kannada bot, right? I mean, right now this doesn't exist, right? And there is an enormous desire, I would say. I mean, I like this picture. I think it captures the spirit of our youth. There is a need for these students to be helped with to whatever extent we can, and those of us at least who are interested in the edtech space. And this is increasingly not just technologists. I mean, I mentioned at the start I am a computer scientist, but increasingly there is opportunity for all of us to contribute. There are, in this incredible movement now of what is called no-code development, where you can create applications even if you don't know very much programming. But if you are an educationist, as most of us are, there is an opportunity here to help create a set of tools, educational tools, that can improve the massive challenges that we face in education in our country. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. I found your explanation and your presentation to be extremely informative. Not only does it emphasize on what has been happening, but you're also looking into what could be done. And I feel like you have touched upon a wide gamut of things that as educationers and academics, we need to focus on. So I would like to thank you for that. Before we move into the question answer session, there are a couple of general instructions. I want all the participants to please listen to these instructions. Participants are requested to switch on their videos during the question answer session, as photographs will be taken. All of you are free to type your questions in the chat box, either on Zoom or YouTube. Questions will be asked to the speaker by me on your behalf. Participants must also ensure that they fill the feedback form, the link for which will be posted in the chat box soon. We are now opening the house for a question answer session. Sir, I would request you to please switch on your video, as it would be beneficial if the participants could see you. Okay, thank you.
Sure. I look. Yeah.
Okay. I have a list of questions, sir. We will go through them one by one. May I start?
Please, please. I look forward to it.
Okay. So the first question is by Professor Madan. He wants to find out about, his question is, what is the status of free and compulsory education system under the RTE Act of the new education policy? He also has a supplementary question which says, does this apply for teachers who teach physical education or perhaps drawing as well? Because schools are not being considered under this policy. And he wants to, his third sub question is, what is the student teacher ratio when it comes to tribal states? Do you want me to go one by one, sir?
Okay, so the one that was talking about, our school, yes, I mean, this policy covers everything, all the way from preschool to higher education. And as I mentioned at the start, in this expanded 5+3+3+4, this is the first policy that recognizes that preschool education, age 3 to 6, is something that needs to be addressed. Now, as far as my understanding is concerned, this has not been put into the same framework as RTE, but this is still a clear commitment on the part of the government that this age group 3 to 6 has to be brought into the fold, and the proposals that are there in the policy and the implementation mechanism is supposed to take care of that age group has opportunities which otherwise they did not have. As I mentioned, we've had this ECCE, the Anganwadi system, which by and large does not provide educational inputs to students. So the first thing that is changing is the Anganwadi system is being strengthened to provide that. And as I said, that there is a recognition that even amongst sort of the private players in the preschool space, there was no regulation in terms of what this should achieve. So this move towards having the first 5 years as this unstructured foundational group will affect all that system as well. Right? And then the third question was, can you just remind me, please? You are on mute, Professor. Professor, you are on mute. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay, the third part of his question was, what is the student-teacher ratio in the nation when it comes, and is there a special provision for tribal states?
Okay, I'm not familiar with that that particular detail. I apologize. I think it's something. The document is there. I think you can. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that detail.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think actually it's a good concept in itself that they have focused a lot more on primary and school education here as well, because whenever we talk about education, we tend to focus a lot more on higher education. However, primary education builds up the foundation for it. So I believe it's a good idea that they have implemented or focused upon. Okay. The next question, sir, is by Mr. Amandeep Kumar. He asks you, what are the challenges in implementing this NEP given a lot of diversity?
Yes, and as I said, I think in the talk, we have a history, I would say, of writing wonderful policy documents in our country and of not implementing them as well as we should. And I think this is why I'm so excited to speak to all of you, that, all of us are educationists, all of us care about this deeply. And I think what I wanted to share in this talk was, look, these are the principles of the policy. This is what the policy is trying to say. This is why it's trying to say what it is. And I think there is a responsibility for all of us as educationists to respond as best we can. I mean, the policy provides a direction. It is, of course, going to be a critical piece for the powers that be to provide the resources so that educationists like us can do what we think is in the best interests of education and of our students. So I would like to just say, I don't think it is productive for us as educationists to say, well, what can we do? I mean, if it doesn't get implemented, then it's somebody else's fault. I would like us to take from this talk this feeling that, yes, at some level we believe this. I mean, we may not agree with everything in the policy. I think that is fine. Personally, as I said, I contributed to the policy. I don't agree with every point that was finally put forward. I mean, I respect the difference in my views and the policy's views. That is fine, but I think the policy makes a huge step towards addressing some of the major challenges. I think it makes several good moves, and I don't think the responsibility ends with, well, the government has to do it, and we just have to sort of swim along with that tide. I think all of us have a responsibility to and an opportunity and a commitment to do what we can, right? So I think that is the thing I would like to say. I mean, we are here as educationists, not as people sitting UGC or the school boards or something like that. Right?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. Sudhir. He wants to know, does the university affiliation system remain, or will there be changes in that?
The policy is very clear that the affiliation system has to end. Now, again, I will say that this is not a statement that is unique to this policy. We have been making this commitment or desire clear because we recognize that it is no longer serving the purpose that it should, and it's really, adversely impacting our education system. So the policy is clear. We have to move towards autonomous institutions. The timeline, is, again, this is the points where I would have hoped that we could be more aggressive with the timeline to move towards it. But I think there's some timeline that has been given. I forget if it is 15 years where we end the affiliation system. But yes, it's clear that we have to end it.
Okay. All right. Dr. Sudhir has a follow-up question. He wants to know, do the NBA and NAAC, will they merge together to bring out a new accreditation process?
So there is a new accreditation system. So I didn't get a chance to discuss regulation accreditation at all, given the available time. NBA remains as is because there is this whole Washington Accords. That's a separate signatory thing, so we're not touching that so much. But yes, there is a completely different role for NAC. I mean, so there's a slight difference in naming. It's called NAC, and it basically plays the role of a super accreditor. The basic idea is NAC, the NAAC as it currently stands, simply doesn't have the resources to accredit the number of institutions that we have. As a result, there are many institutions that are essentially not accredited, and that they're falling by the wayside. So the idea is to have a superstructure, which is NAC, and then they themselves will oversee separate entities which will provide accreditation as a service. And of course, if there's any issue that these separate entities, which will be run as the separate agencies, if any of those are not doing their due diligence, then their ability to function will be revoked, right? So NAC will play the super accreditor role, and the whole idea is that this series of accreditation bodies under it would provide accreditation as a service, and that would be their business model. I mean, they would be essentially they would do it as a business, but if there's any hint that they are corrupted in the process, then that business gets shut down immediately.
Okay. I think in relation to this question, we can move on to Mr. Sandeep Warpe's question. He asks, can new policy ban corruption in teacher and assistant professor recruitment if policy reflects autonomous or private education?
Okay, I will do my best to answer the question. My request to you, Professor, is all the questions so far have been from men, and there are by far, I'm sure, a large number of women who have asked questions. I would just request you to make sure that we have a few questions from women as well. So obviously the policy itself cannot ban corruption. It does make many statements about revising recruitment processes because clearly there are challenges that we have in that. Again, I think this comes down to actual implementation. The policy can only provide the guidelines, and the strength at which those policies are implemented is going to really be the key to how we deal with this. And this is something that the policy can only articulate a direction.
Okay, sir. We have a question from Ms. Jaya Santi. She wants to know this assessment of NEP, which is testing skill competencies with no importance to memorization. Is it applicable to all or only to vocational courses?
No, it's applicable to all. And I think the policy is not saying, there is no emphasis on memorization. I think it is clear that there is a significant overemphasis on memorization in our current system. And I think that is the first thing that we have to address. And, I think the whole assessment framework has to change. And this is, again, I think something as educationists, we can start taking action on this today. We don't have to wait for anybody's input on this. I mean, this is something, as if we believe as educationists, we are doing a disservice to our students. I think this is important for us to start taking the case to our management, our department heads, saying, look, here is a better way. The policy is for this. Our institution can take the lead. And I just want to share in this context, one of the tasks that I have recently taken. So AICTE some years ago came out with 2 years ago, 2018, came out with a education reforms policy, examination reforms policy, beg your pardon. And so one of the committees that I am now contributing towards is coming up with question banks based on this policy, right? And one of the things we want to make it clear is that it is possible to ask questions that are deeper than simply memorization or simply apply some technique that we have taught students, so just at the sort of level 1, 2, 3 of Bloom's taxonomy, it is possible to go beyond that while still making the questions doable for many students, right? I mean, it's not like we make these super hard questions. It doesn't mean that just because a question is going beyond level 3 of Bloom's taxonomy, it suddenly becomes impossible for students to tackle. So one of the things that we are trying to do is showcase through a question bank that this is how we can do this. And this applies to all levels of education. I mean, what I'm sharing with you, the AICTE work, of course, is just for higher education, engineering education in particular, but it applies to all levels of schooling.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have a question from Ms. Yashaswini M. She says, what possible measures do you think could be taken to ensure that we bridge the gap of the digital divide? Okay,
so it's an excellent question. I mentioned very briefly in my slides 2 things which I will touch on. One is EduSat. I mentioned, of course, that is from some years ago, but it's interesting that if you want to reach out to every last square kilometer of our country, satellite is still the best way of doing it. I mean, there are places where it is just so expensive to provide network capacity, right? There is that. So there is this. There are the furthest corners of our country which are going to remain very, very hard to connect. And I think that's just the reality of our geography and our limited resources. There is also a very large portion of the country which is not well connected so far, but for which, BSNL as a government agency has played and will continue to play a very important role. And this is that role where BSNL goes in and lays out this initial set of connectivity and creates a large enough group of people who are now connected and are using digital services. And then it starts becoming more economically viable for some of the private players to follow. And this is a model that has played out several times. And this is something that I see has a lot of promise. I mean, none of this is to say that more resources should not be invested. Definitely more resources should be invested. You mentioned at the start in your introduction, I had done some work with Karnataka Jnana Yoga. In 2014, we were making the same case to the government. So, the fact that we were this unprepared for the digital divide when COVID hit is a reflection of the fact that, yes, not as much was done as could be done. Or, of course, there are priorities, and I respect that, but certainly it would be critical to devote more resources. And I'm mentioning, the BSNL model as something that I see as promising. It is certainly something we have a long way to go towards. It is one of the big challenges for doing online education today.
Okay. If I may follow up with what you just said,
Please.
sir.
Please.
Yes, currently, I think the mode of education because of the pandemic has shifted to being an online mode. However, I feel like due to the advantage of today's generation being much more technologically savvy than compared to the previous ones, do we see this becoming something much more common? Do we see technological aspects being used in regular classes as well once I hope everything settles down and becomes back to usual? Do you think that might be a case?
Yes, I think there are clear advantages that we can leverage, right? I mean, if you just think about, the ability to review as a student a recorded lecture, right? I mean, this is something we have been doing now, as I said, with this Swayam platform, NPTEL, things like that, these kinds of educational resources. We've been doing it for a long time. And one of the things that, the response to the current crisis was, well, maybe we should allow more than, the current, say, 20% or whatever, of credits can be earned through online courses. Maybe we should try and increase that percentage. I think it's not just a question of, having this either or, that, it's either face-to-face or online. I think there are many other intermediate models that we can explore. And I think the only silver lining to this horrible pandemic is that it has forced all of us to start experimenting. And so there is much greater, I mean, this is a moment in history where, all of us are willing to think of this dimension, because we are forced to, and I think in this moment, I'm hoping that there will be some wonderful creativity, whether it is, as I mentioned, from tech savvy faculty, whether it is from young entrepreneurs. I think we should see some groundbreaking work. I mean, in my own modest way, I'm trying to interest some students of mine, to use their technical skills to tackle this. But here we are, 400 of us, who attending this talk, probably more on YouTube. And this is an opportunity for some of us. And as I mentioned, I want to just clearly say this, that even if we are not techno savvy ourselves, as educationists, we understand the challenges that we are facing, and our students, as someone rightly mentioned, are able to pick up some of these technologies quicker, right? So this group of students that I'm working with, I mean, I don't understand all the technologies that they're going to use. I mean, that's okay with me. I have a clear understanding of the problem that I want to solve, the educational challenge that I want to solve. And I say, you give me a solution that solves my problem. I, as an educationist, will tell you that this is a problem worth solving. You figure out what you want to use. I mean, I'm fine with it. So I think that's an approach many of us can take. And you don't have to be a computer scientist like me to take that view. I mean, you said you at the start, I think you said your profession is in English, if I'm correct. And so I'm sure you can see challenges, and I'm sure similarly a lot of our colleagues here on the call can see and define challenges, and just find committed students to do the work for us, and then we can test it, and then this NetF becomes one way in which we can start evaluating this. So it's not just something that works in your class, maybe the whole country can use it.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have a question from Ms. Drasha. She wants to know what can be the role of distance education when the distance educations depend on regular system for support services. Can the online study replace the ODL system?
So the ODL system is, the current ODL system is clearly in disrepute. I think that's the only way the word to use it. By and large, the ODL systems are much poorer than existing systems, and this is absolutely no reason why this should be the case, right? So I think here again it is a question of providing a process of quality assurance. And so one of the comments that we got when we were looking at this from the accreditation side, I won't name the organization because I don't think that is productive, but the comment was that there simply aren't resources to evaluate to the same level the accreditation system, the online programs, right? And I think absent that sunlight, that quality assurance, that is part of why we are seeing this. So in the new policy, ODL has an important role to play. There is clear statements that they have to be accredited to the same rigorous standards, and that's really the only way to do it, right? But of course, the point is that if we're doing it in a purely online mode, we will have the challenges that we mentioned. So some mixture, as I think the questioner rightly pointed out, that it has to work in close concert with the existing system, the educational system, the traditional education system. So what I see is not so much this dichotomy that this face-to-face and ODL is something else on the side. I think there is a spectrum which we have to explore.
So you are kind of talking about finding a better blended approach in the near future, right?
Yes. That has become a very sexy word in Delhi these days, blended learning.
Okay, sir. Okay, the next question is by Mr. Elango Subramaniam. He wants to know what role will be played by the state education boards as it also leads to school dropouts.
Yes, and given the structure that we have, where schooling is a state subject, there has to be this recognition that states are individually responsible. I think some of the policies which I didn't get to touch here, the way they try and address this challenge is to create what's the right term for it? Competition among states where the challenge is to go up rather than to fail down. We have a lot of sort of rush to the bottom. Not intentionally, just the way some of our incentive structures are. There is this desire to rush to the bottom, or it becomes easier to rush to the bottom. So one of the things that the policy tries very explicitly to do is create incentive structures that the center can set up so that states are actually competing competitively, but more importantly, they're trying to learn from each other in terms of what has worked. The whole point of having this sort of federal system is, we have all these different experiments happening in different states, and there is some great work, as we all know. Some states have done amazing work in certain areas, and there has to be an information exchange, and as I said, opportunity for states to showcase this thing. So definitely state boards will have to have the incentives around them changed, and the policy does try to address some of those.
Okay. The next question is by Mr. Muhammad Shamim. He wants to know, is there any policy for the safety of women and transgenders at working places under the NEP?
Yes, so definitely, and both these points were very carefully addressed. So I think you will find, I didn't quote any of those points from the policy, but I think one of the nice things about having the document as a PDF, you can just search for this. So for example, why don't I do this right now? I mean, I won't share the document, but I happen to have the PDF open in front of me, and I'm just going to search for the word transgender. And I see that there are 4 occurrences of it in the document, right? So there are at least 4 places where this issue is mentioned, and I would request everyone who has these kinds of questions, to just look at the policy and see this. I'm sorry, I don't have a encyclopedic knowledge of. I haven't memorized the whole policy in my head, but I have the PDF, and I will search for it when I want to have this thing. And I would encourage all of us who are interested to look at this. And as I said, since we have this ability to do search, it's not a text, it's not a piece of paper, we should do this. Yeah.
Okay. Another question by Dr. Kalpana Singh is, does the NEP focus more on vocational and skill-based learning than theoretical mode of learning, which has been prominent so far?
I think that's fair. It's moving the needle a little bit. I mean, again, this is not to say we should not do theory, but we have been doing far too much of that. And we have, in fact, even what we have been doing is, as I said, essentially not productive. I mean, suppose I ask you on an exam, to repeat some theoretical statement from the textbook. I mean, how does that benefit the world? I mean, today, Google knows that statement much better than you, if you need to look up some fact. So it is application of knowledge, and much more importantly, creation of new knowledge. I mean, getting to beyond level 3 of Bloom's taxonomy, as I said, which is much more important. I mean, even application, I mean, very quickly, as I mentioned, with technology changes, I mean, technology is going to be able to apply well-known techniques much better than any human being. So even that is going to be, not very helpful to students down the road. And we are, at many places, that's the highest we get to. I mean, if you look at some of the exams that, we were all familiar with this as educationists, I mean, the 2 most common types of questions you typically have is, define something, which is simply recalling facts, right? Or take what you know and apply it in this specific context. I mean, say, so I've taught you how to solve quadratic equations in school. Okay, so now here for this equation, solve this equation. It's that kind of a question. It's applying your knowledge. At the end of the day, that kind of stuff is easy to automate. And if there is a job behind that, that job will go away. No one will pay you for that skill. So we have to go beyond that. But the vocational part, the hands-on part, I gave that example in the talk of the person who has to fix that motor. I mean, it's completely infeasible to have a robot come and fix your motor. I mean, it's just not going to happen economically anytime soon, especially in our country. So there's a huge opportunity for skilled jobs. I mean, vocational skills, but coupled then with, maybe this smart glass or whatever it is, or a voice in your ear that provides you the directions. If you remember from years ago that movie, The Matrix, the person gets into the helicopter and has to fly it, and then just downloads the instructions, and then knows how to fly the helicopter or whatever it is. I mean, that's science fiction, but versions of that is what I'm talking about. Where we're allying vocation with some tech, high tech.
Okay. We have a question by Dr. Ajay Garg. He wants to know how to protect self-financed teacher jobs according to the new policy, and do they in any way talk about the payment gaps when it comes to education, like teachers, in comparison to any other jobs?
Okay, it's an excellent point. And I think one of the clear things you will get from reading the segments on teachers is this policy recognizes that teachers are absolutely critical, right, to success in the educational space. There is this payment gap. There is a gap in work environment that I briefly mentioned, as some of the challenges that are there. And so a substantial amount of policy is around improving work environment and working conditions for teachers, the sort of tenure process that's moving away from ad hoc positions and providing greater security for faculty. So that is point number 1. But point number 2, which is, where I foresee some of the threats coming from. I mean, one of the things that I have been doing is looking very carefully, since I'm interested in the ed tech space, looking at the threat to teacher job security from some of the other educational models that are driven by tech. And a very flippant way of saying this, and I don't think this is the right thing, but I will mention this because it is common. It is commonly mentioned, which is, any teacher who can be replaced by technology should be replaced by technology. And it's a very flippant way of making a statement, but in that flippancy there is a germ of truth, which is the following: that as educationists, we have to be aware of some of these threats, and we have to very carefully reflect on what it is that we are providing as educationists that is impossible to provide through technology. But we can harness technology to be better teachers ourselves, right? So it requires this constant looking over one's shoulder, and it doesn't have to be an individual effort. I mean, this is something that can be done even at an institutional level or a departmental level, where some of us who are more attuned to these things sort of keep an eye on these things and have seminar series for all of us, the rest of us, to mention and to reflect on. Look, these are some of the tools that are now available. Does this change how you teach? Does this change how you assess? For example, suppose there is a tool that can automatically generate questions for your exam, right? Would you be interested in using such a tool? And what if you're finding that the kinds of questions that tool can generate are actually pretty good? I mean, it's not just some copy paste from some website. It is actually using some intelligence to come up with good questions. Certainly, I would be interested as an educator in looking at it. And then I would say, well, does this mean now I don't have that job while setting question papers? I mean, yes, maybe if the system decides that that's a much better way of generating questions, it's fairer, less error prone, whatever it is. But then the next question I have to ask as a teacher is, so what am I going to do with that extra time I have? How am I going to be a better educator now that I know this? And there are many answers we can think about. But what I'm saying is, I think we shouldn't expect that the policy is going to end up with, be implemented in a way where job security is guaranteed. I think there is still going to be this onus on us, and not just as teachers, but as anyone else living in the 21st century, to sort of be looking at technology and saying, does that threaten my job? Because I use that term disruptive technologies, and the policy uses that term disruptive technologies, because we have to recognize these things are going to be disruptive, And I'm not saying this to be scaremongering, right? I think it is just a reality. And I am convinced, I'm 100% convinced that as educators, what we can provide students through our face-to-face, through our ability to interact with them as humans, goes far beyond what technology is going to be capable of, certainly in our lifetimes, And I think we have to leverage that strength. And I just think we have to be, creative about how we think about it, not just be terrified that that's going to take my job away.
Okay. Before we wrap up the question answer session, I would personally like to ask you the last question from my end. Of all the things while you were speaking, one thing which struck to me particularly was the fact that you were talking about how the entire system which comes around with assessing students' knowledge, the entrance examination format for that matter, how you feel that it is not a good or an actually viable method, because students' IQ, EQ, it differs. Some people are better at memorizing and writing, whereas some are better at practical approaches than at theory, perhaps. But
Right.
Also, when we are doing this, you yourself in the beginning said that we think that education here as a right for every student, that they must be educated, must not drop out during school level or at higher education. But don't you think by having this kind of entrance examination, we ourselves are filtering students out of the chance, like leaving them? You can't say that because you do not score a 90%, you are not eligible for this kind of education, right? We ourselves are filtering students out, aren't we?
it's an excellent point, and I'm glad you have used your prerogative to ask the last question to ask such an excellent one. So I think one of the answers I would give is with online education, if we can get it to work, we have an opportunity to reduce this artificial barrier in terms of how many students we can cater to, and where as a teacher I am empowered with tools to interact virtually with hundreds of students as opposed to 60 students or whatever my current limit is in the classroom, right? So I think this is a space we have to explore, right? Today many of us are doing these online classes because we're forced to on platforms like Zoom. Zoom is not meant for education. I mean, we're retrofitting, and in the same way that we are retrofitting a business technology called PowerPoint for teaching, it's not a great fit. Similarly, we're talking about retrofitting this Zoom technology for interaction. I mean, there's right now I'm seeing there's 260 more participants. Some of them I can see the faces and they're interested, they're looking, and the same experience I'm getting in a classroom, that you're nodding your head, and so I know, okay, she's engaged, that other gentleman over there, he's engaged. I know that there is something, some focus that's happening. But what about the other 200 people who are not on my screen? I have no feedback as to whether I'm being effective with them, right? And there is no reason why technology cannot give me some feedback on this, and therefore there is no reason in which it doesn't allow us to scale, at least to some extent, to more students. I mean, the reason we have all this aggressive filtering, etc., is oftentimes just simply because we don't have the opportunity to let so many people in. I will add one last point on this, which is when it comes to entrance exams, right? So today, again, we use entrance exams just simply, even if we have as an educational institution, we have something more. We want to look at the portfolio of work that the students have done, or we want to have an interview with them to assess some of those other key issues beyond just marks. Today, we are still using boards or whatever as a filtering mechanism because we don't want to evaluate so many people, right? Again, this is an opportunity here for technology to look at the full portfolio, of the student. Of course, it requires the portfolio to be in some digital form, right, which is a restriction. But there is a potential here to expand the set of things that we look for and filter on the basis of, to not just be scores, right? I mean, it could be, in your case, for example, look at essays that students have written, and you don't have time to read all those essays, but maybe and some automated system can use some metrics to say, well, there's some that are very good, that are worth looking at. Then even if that person did really badly on the board exam or the entrance exam, they wrote such a fabulous essay, you are interested in considering that person. So it broadens the set. But your bigger point about should we be even having filtering at all, I think the only way we get around that is, more institutions and more open institutions, which is, we have to move to this online mode in some way, and there are challenges.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I feel like this discourse with you has been not only informative but also engaging, because you're not only talking about the pros of the particular concept that we are discussing today. We are discussing both the pros and the cons, and that is one perhaps a better way of moving forward. Like the example just that you just mentioned yourself. When it comes to, since I'm an English teacher, if it comes to an essay, if I see a student writing it physically, I can know what errors that person makes when it comes to grammar or punctuation. But since now they type it on Word and Grammarly edits all of it for them itself, I cannot comprehend whether my student is brilliant, I am brilliant, or is it the software which is doing all the work? So there are certain cons in that way as well, I suppose, which perhaps other geniuses such as yourself might find solutions for.
Well, if you want to discuss that particular one, you have my email. I would like to discuss that particular one with you because I have a suggestion for you. But like that, I would like to engage with a lot of you, it's been a real pleasure. I really thank you for your attention and the
Thank you, sir.
opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, we wrap up the question answer session for today. With this, we come to the end of the webinar on National Educational Policy 2020, a review. However, feeling gratitude and not expressing it is kind of like wrapping a present and not giving it. So it is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks and extend a heartfelt gratitude to one and all that made this event successful. On behalf of the Faculty Research Cells from Shodhana School of Commerce, I would like to thank all those involved in ensuring a successful conduction of this webinar. The most earnest feeling of appreciation is for our speaker, Dr. Viraj Kumar, for sparing his time today and for being generous enough to help us in understanding what are the things that we can do as teachers ourselves and what we have to look at when it comes to the future of the educational policy through this webinar session. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. There was a request on the chat for my email address. My Gmail address can be shared with participants if they would like to reach out.
Sure, sir. We will do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you once again.
Okay. I would also like to express my gratitude to the various heads of departments, coordinators, and faculty members from the School of Commerce for their continuous support, guidance, and active participation in keeping up the spirit of teaching and learning even in these times. Gratitude is towards all the members who are a part of the organizing team for their support in ensuring a successful conduct of the webinar. And my humble thanks to all the participants without whom this webinar would not have been possible. I would like to thank all of you. I hope you have all filled the feedback form which was provided in the chat box. That will ensure your e-certificate will reach you within 10 days. I would also request all participants to please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for further information. A recording of today's webinar will also be posted or will be available on our YouTube channel. The link is provided in the chat box. I hope you all had an engaging and informative session today. I thank you for your presence. With that, I would like to end today's session. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting it.
Thank you, sir.